This is a story about the word hero. Who uses it? Who's called it? Less than 1% of Americans served in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the support for them is unequivocal. They're lauded in speeches. They're thanked for their service. They're called heroes.
To honor you, the heroes.
So why are some vets pushing back against this?
Many veterans of our generation really balk at the term hero, saying, no, I was just doing my job.
I've done it. I've stopped doing it.
We don't need parades and celebrations. We need people to give us an opportunity when we come home.
It often now makes the veterans themselves feel uncomfortable.
I'd be embarrassed if someone called me a hero for joining the Marine Corps.
There's almost a sense of guilt that comes with it, I think.
They worry the word is becoming devalued, that it takes away from true heroes, that it obscures real issues that need to be addressed. But what does this mean for the relationship between civilians and veterans?
You know, are we going to push back too hard that we swing the other way where it's like, well, screw you guys?
I had close friends. We had children exactly the same age. And so, you know, Barry and I helped coach the soccer team together. We knew each other for about 8 or 10 years. Sleepovers with the kids overnight and everything. And one evening, the wives were talking and realized that their husbands had both been Marines in Vietnam. We were both Marines in Vietnam, didn't know it for 8 or 10 years. That was the atmosphere back then. You never talked about being in the Vietnam War. You kept your mouth shut.
Did society use the word hero at all? I mean, how was it used in sort of the context?
No.
Oh, beautiful, our heroes proved.
I think to the country's credit, they don't do that anymore. The pendulum may have swung just too far. Now everybody's a hero instead of a villain. That's not true either.
I think all of them, all the veterans are heroes just because they volunteer alone, just to keep our safety, you know, here back home.
That's why we have Veterans Day, so we can celebrate the heroes and everybody can talk about them and, you know, raise them up.
It's someone that puts their country ahead of themselves.
Are they heroes to you?
Oh, absolutely. Every day of the week.
There's this thing that's been happening over the past few years, where you get veterans becoming more vocal and pushing back on the hero label.
I think it's really important that veterans, we make this messy. We make those conversations messy and complicated and nuanced, because that's what people are.
Okay, so I'm a veteran. I served with the Marine Corps in Iraq back during the beginning of the war in 2003. And I do find these messy conversations really difficult. It's like sometimes you just don't know what way to think. It's like a tug of war. And that happens a lot, especially when someone thanks you for your service. And this is what goes through my mind.
I get snapped out of the moment, and there's this intense flood of memories about what it meant to serve, the good times, the hardships, what it meant for my family. I think of the Marines I knew who didn't come home.
And I realize I'm expected to respond, but what do I say?
I want to do those memories justice, but that would mean sitting down and talking for hours with a stranger. But then that feels like I'm not doing all those intense memories justice, and I feel guilty. But then I feel ungrateful.
You can sniff out very quickly where the impetus for that question or for the statement is coming from, and if it's coming from a flippant or shallow place, that's deeply frustrating. But if it's coming from an earnest place, a genuine place, and maybe they just don't know what else to do.
You know, a lot of us say, don't call us hero, don't thank us for our service, or you feel awkward when somebody says that to you, which I totally get. In the same token, you know, are we going to push back too hard that we swing the other way where it's like, well, screw you guys?
Last year, there was a big survey of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. 42% said they didn't think civilian respect for the military was genuine. About 70% said they often felt misunderstood. But almost the same number also said they felt appreciated. So that's what makes this all so complex.
These are lives. These are people's lives that we're talking about, and how we interpret, how we as civilians interpret their lives impacts them. It impacts their ability to carry forward on a daily basis.
Zeno is a counselor to veterans, and he also studies heroism.
Veterans are not fragile people, but they have had very complex experiences. And so we need to be a society that is in conversation with our veterans, not telling them you are a hero or you're not a hero.
Let's start at the beginning. The dictionary defines hero as an illustrious warrior, one that shows great courage. But I wanted to know where our idea of what a hero is even came from.
What I started doing when I was researching heroism was to go back to the ancient Greeks, and in particular to Achilles and the Trojan War. And Achilles is the kind of hero par excellence. He is the best warrior, he's the fastest. He tears through the enemy. He's not doing it on behalf of someone else. For him, the idea is simply to be great.
But fast forward about 800 years, to a jail cell, to Socrates on trial for practicing philosophy. It's where he turns down an opportunity to escape.
He says, I have to follow the laws. I want to lead by example in some sense and show people that they're wrong about what they think about philosophy, that it's dangerous. So he says, I have to do this for them, but also for future philosophers.
He sacrifices his life for other people, for an ideal. And that's where Cohen thinks our modern interpretation of heroism comes from.
Even in war, it's not enough for us now, right, to go and kill 50 people, right? That's very impressive. That's an Achilles level of impressive. But we even want our great warriors to end up sacrificing for others.
So the criteria has shrunk, but the usage of the word seems to be growing.
Right. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, so that's the Socrates hero story, and it's pretty cut and dry. He was just a really selfless guy. But here's a more complicated story, and it starts with the idea that you never hear people say that they actually want to become a hero or that they actually want to earn medals.
But that's exactly what was on the mind of 22-year-old Marine Carl Merlantes in 1968.
My guess is if a young man doesn't think about doing something heroic in battle, I think that it would be highly unusual. Of course, I thought about it. I mean, imagine that you'd like to be John Wayne, too.
But as it turned out, that desire would haunt him for the rest of his life.
The Bronze Star was on an assault, and I was the company XO.
As the rifle company moved forward, Carl heard a young Marine cry out that he'd been hit.
I had the idea that, I can go get him. And there was a double motive. The first motive was, I really like this guy. I had to get him out from underneath the machine gun, and that was noble. But the second one, I thought it'd be pretty neat if I got a medal. It occurred to me. I went, whoa.
Carl charged up the hill alone. He kept firing to keep the enemy machine gunners at bay. And when he reached the wounded Marine, Carl pulled him down the hill to safety. Then the medic arrived, Doc Yankee.
And see, I can still get quite sad about this. I mean, after all these years, I remember Yankee. Trying to give him artificial respiration, and the kid was vomiting. And so Yankee would get vomit and spit vomit out and blow air into him and suck vomit out. And then Doc Yankee looked at me and he said, "Oh no!" And he pulled the kid's head back and there was a bullet hole right in his head. He said, "He's not going to make it." That night, it occurred to me that he had said, "I'm hit." How could he say it was hit with a bullet in his head? There was no way I could find out if, in fact, the bullet in his head hadn't been the one I put there when I was trying to keep the machine gunner's head down. And I'll never know to this day. And the lesson drawn from that is I would feel way less sad about it or conflicted about it if I had done it from totally pure motives. Then I realized that they were going to give me a Bronze Star for it, and like I said, I had mixed feelings, because it was like, I may have gotten this medal because I did something that ended up killing a guy.
A few months later, Carl would earn another medal, the second highest a Marine can receive, the Navy Cross. But in this case, Achilles would become Socrates. Again, his unit was on the assault, but they were pinned down. Carl ran out all by himself to clear the enemy bunkers. But suddenly he realized he was no longer alone. Off to the side came one of his men.
And I looked behind him, and all the Marines were coming up behind me, the whole line. And I mean, to this day, I get emotional about it, because to see all these kids just coming up that hill. And we hit the line of bunkers, and we took the hill. The massive difference between getting the Navy Cross and that Bronze Star is that I was just trying to get us out of a pickle. I was trying to figure out how to save people. It's your motivations that are what's really important about heroism, more than the deed itself.
In October, I traveled to Boston, and this happened in the city's main park. It was a gathering of over half the living Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. There are only 78. It's the military's highest and most public award.
You know, I feel like, you know, I'm not a hero. I didn't do anything more heroic than 52 other guys that were with me that day on the battlefield. The 8 guys that never made it home, those guys were the heroes.
Clint Romeshay received the medal for his actions when 400 Taliban fighters attacked his outpost in 2009.
Never in a million years did I ever think I'd be wearing this little blue ribbon of silk around my neck. It's the farthest thing from your mind. And so when it happens, it's very, you know, emotional, very just a lot of stuff happening at once. It's kind of hard to process. As much as you'd like to travel all over the U.S. and talk to everybody and shake everyone's hand, you know, you still have a lot back on the home front that you need to take care of.
Zeno, the psychologist we met earlier, says what's complex about heroism is that it's an intensely private act, but it also becomes intensely public, too.
They have to make a choice, literally often go or no go, right? And that's a very personal choice in that moment. They take the next action that they see as necessary, and then people label them as a hero, and they said, I didn't do anything heroic, I just did the next thing.
Medal of Honor recipients don't have a choice if their actions are known or not, but other veterans do. The story of one begins with the Vietnam vet.
My name is Walter Robinson. I write for the Boston Globe, where I have worked since 1972.
Because he's a veteran, he's kind of a go-to guy when a story involves military records. In the fall of 2014, a Marine veteran of Iraq was running for Congress in Massachusetts, Seth Moulton. Walter called a campaign consultant so we could take a look at Moulton's military records.
The campaign probably huddles and says, is there anything in it we should be worried about? As we found out later, the consultant didn't know what was in those records. I got the record, which indicated that on 2 separate occasions, he had been decorated for some valorous action under fire in combat leading his men in Iraq.
It turned out that no one in the public or on the campaign staff knew about the awards, except for Moulton's campaign manager, who was also a Marine. At one point, not even his parents knew of the medal.
In a way, we kind of caught him. I mean, in an odd way, not taking credit for something that he damn well deserved to take credit for. It was very apparent from the beginning that he was uncomfortable talking about it.
Just curious if you remember the moment that you found out you were going to be awarded the Bronze Star and how that made you sort of feel in the moment.
To be perfectly honest, I don't remember it. I mean, it's not such a big deal in the military because we were just doing what we thought was right.
Do people call you hero?
I mean, some people do. Sometimes my colleagues in Congress refer to me as a war hero, and I don't think that's true. And I know they're doing it to be nice, but it honestly makes me feel a bit uncomfortable.
Why do you think it's a bigger deal to civilians?
I think that a lot of Americans who don't have a real connection to the troops are looking for something to grasp onto, something to celebrate. Frankly, we don't need that as veterans. We don't need parades and celebrations. We need people to give us an opportunity when we come home. I think one of the problems with the wars we've been involved in for the past decade or so is that all the sacrifice is borne by the troops and their families. If more Americans were involved, if more Americans were asked to participate in some way, then there probably wouldn't be this sense of guilt where we always have to be super conscious of protecting the troops and doing what's right for the troops. Not that doing what's right for the troops is wrong, I mean, that's exactly what we should be doing. But there's almost a sense of guilt that comes with it, I think, for many civilians.
I met a veteran who actually did have post-traumatic stress. And he said, you know, I don't tell stories about Iraq because the only stories that people want to hear are about the worst things that ever happened to me.
So there's this idea that some veterans have that they feel that they can only talk about the stories that they think people want to hear, stories that are really exciting or really violent or really funny, but they're actually not the stories that mean the most to the veterans themselves.
A few months ago, I met with 3 veterans who are all writers. They belong to a group called Words After War. Phil Cly even won the National Book Award last year for his collection of short stories. So they know a thing or two about narratives.
What is the story you think people want to hear, civilians want to hear coming out of veterans when they come home? And what's the story that you think they should hear?
It's interesting because it's changed over time. So early on, there was a particular sort of guy that I seemed to keep meeting, who, when he found out that I was in the Marine Corps, would ask me like, oh, you ever shoot those big guns that could kill somebody from far away? And would want the exciting, aggressive stories. At a certain point, I realized that that kind of expectation had shifted, and what I tended to be getting in New York much more often was people assuming that I was broken.
I remember when I came back, I definitely wanted to get that assurance that what I did was masculine, and so I would tell the stories about, you know, being downrange. And to now, stories that mean the most to me are the times where the sun's just coming over Kandahar, and I know the day is going to be crazy, but like there's just that lull in the battle, right? And I get that peace to myself.
The problem is that many veterans find it hard to share these deeply personal stories because so few back home have served.
We as veterans have a responsibility to meet people halfway.
A small number of people have a big responsibility, it seems like.
Absolutely, and it greatly limits the direct connection that everyday Americans have with these wars, right? Not just, well, it's not my son or my daughter anymore, but sequentially, it's not even the kid down the street anymore.
You call that folded? Where's that military precision?
We didn't fold many onesies in the Navy.
This is the U.S. sitcom Modern Family. And this is Jay, who sometimes brings up the fact he's a Navy veteran.
I wasn't worried I'd boxed in the Navy.
And that's it.
Jay in Modern Family is a prime example of a neutralized portrayal of a veteran. He is just the guy next door who you happen to find out served in the Navy.
You want to see more of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we need to kind of get away from broken and hero. Folks just need to know that veterans are literally your neighbor.
Kate was a soldier in Iraq, and now she's with an advocacy group called Gotcha 6, which pushes for more realistic portrayals of veterans.
Do you think Hollywood has a responsibility to do this?
I almost think that the media has more responsibility to change the portrayal of veterans. I worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs, and there was a point in time in 2012 when every other week we were writing a story pushing back on the narrative that veterans were taking time bombs, that all veterans suffer from PTSD, TBI, and it really took hold in the media, and that has a huge impact on today's veterans.
While I was reporting this story, I was emailing with a friend about the themes that I was exploring. And at one point she sends me this message, and it really kind of shocked me. And that's because, you know, I use the word civilian all the time, but I never thought about it quite like this.
I remember when I first even became aware of that word. It made me feel like this other. Like I was on a different planet and would never, ever understand war. And that's true. But But that idea of civilian life, a life form so separate and ignorant and sheltered from the experience of war, I don't know. It makes me feel really distant. It makes me feel funny, and it makes me feel guilty.
Our civilian friends may just not get what we did or why we did it. And that's okay.
Veterans can be frustrated with the lack of differentiation that civilians make towards the veteran community. I think it's just as easy for veterans to keep the civilian community at a distance.
But I do think over time it will be a problem in America if fewer and fewer people actually serve, and therefore a greater number of Americans have no connection, real connection, emotional connection, an understanding, a deep understanding.
If everybody's a hero, it's just trivializing something that society really needs.
I think it's a really subjective thing, and it is an uncomfortable one. I don't think there can be a clear, coherent answer, and I don't think there should be.
And if we start losing our heroes, then we're really going to be lost as a society.